Alrighty, hello again and welcome to today's Go One sponsored webinar, Practical Tips for Crafting a Digital Learning Strategy that Creates Value. I'm Hope Williams, Associate Editor at Training Industry, and I'm so glad you could join us for today's event. Before we get started, I have just a few housekeeping items to help you interact with our speaker and get the most out of today's program. Throughout today's event, please feel free to chat comments in your chat window and submit your questions in your Q&A panel, and we'll address those towards the end of the program today. We also encourage you to share the information you receive with your colleagues and network via social media. Please include the handles at GoOneCom and the hashtag TIWebinars so we're able to engage with you and track your contribution to the conversation today. When the program ends, you will see that a short evaluation survey has popped open in your browser, and we greatly welcome your feedback about the content, speaker, or anything else you'd like to share with us today. As always, today's event will be recorded and archived on trainingindustry.com, and you will receive a follow-up email from us with a link to the on-demand recording for you to share with your team. If this is your first webinar with us, a very special welcome goes out to you. Training Industry exists to support the learning leader. We offer timely and insightful information on the business of learning through live events like today's webinar, as well as through website and magazine articles, research reports, referral services, and our podcast, just to name a few. Find all the ways we can connect you with expert perspectives in the industry at trainingindustry.com. And now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce you to our speaker today, Michelle Ockers. Michelle is an organizational learning strategist who helps leaders deepen the impact of their learning in their organizations and create business value. She has expertise in organizational learning strategy, capability uplift for learning teams, and continuous learning practices. Michelle is the Australian Institute of Training and Development's 2019 L&D Professional of the Year and the recipient of the 2019 Internet Time Alliance J. Cross Memorial Award for outstanding contribution to the field of informal learning. She also hosts the Learning Uncut podcast, a series of conversations about real learning solutions with advice from the people who made them happen. Michelle, thank you so much for joining us today and for giving us your time. Without any further ado, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the warm welcome. I really appreciate that. I'm delighted to be talking about learning strategy because I think it's such an important topic at this point in time. I think we're a really critical and exciting point in time in learning with the shifts we've made over the past year and a half, and an opportunity to really leverage those, and being very intentional with your learning strategy is a great way to do that. So these are just some of the organisations I have worked with or am working with at the moment in regard to learning strategy. Probably the biggest one I'm working on at the moment is an organisational learning strategy for the whole of the Australian government, 150,000 people across more than 60 different agencies or departments. So that's been a fascinating piece of work to be undertaking. So that's enough about me at the moment. Let's look at the changing landscape that we're in at the moment in learning and development. And let's start with a poll. I'm curious about the extent to which learning strategy shifted in your organisation in the past year. Let's check in on that. Because everybody started at different places. We've all gone through, a set of circumstances which have played out differently in different countries. And, if you're in the US or the UK, your experience has been very different from what we've had in Australia, where I think our geography, our borders, and being able to close them so quickly and thoroughly has left us in pretty good stead. We're at conferences again. We are back in workplaces with controls in place, although still hybrid working. But for many, it required some significant changes in our learning strategy. And I think Hope will give it another 15 seconds, and then we'll take a look at what people have said about the extent of the shift in their learning strategy. Once you've entered in the poll, I'm curious for you to share some examples of how the changes that you've made have helped you to create value. Okay, so if we look at those poll results, what we see is the highest response was some significant changes. And between significant changes and major changes, let's see how good my maths is this time of day. We've got 61% overall, which is pretty typical of what I'm hearing when I ask this question of different groups. Moderate changes 27%, minor changes 10%, and no change necessary for one person in their organisation. For some organisations, their learning strategy was at a point where they were able to simply, it was a matter of scaling as demand shifted because there were movements in workforce mobility or in demand in their organisation. So they had to move people around and maybe rapidly upskill people. But they were ready for it because they'd done the work around digital transformation for their learning strategy in particular. For others, there were more significant changes that needed to be made. So let's explore in the chat that question of examples of how the changes that you made helped you to create value in your organisation. If you can share those in the chat, that would be interesting to explore. Created a digital learning quality rubric. Mary Ellen, I'm interested in what was on that rubric in terms of how you measured the value of your learning and the value you're creating. Evaluation, of course, is critical. Otherwise, we don't know what impact we're having. So that is a great shift. More focus on self-directed learning. Thank you, Julie. Using tech more comfortably, leveraging digital tools, increasing efficiency. There was a real opportunity, wasn't there, obviously, as people were basically forced to use digital tools in order to continue working. And in many cases, they were tools that were already available, but the take-up, the burning need to take them up hadn't been in place. And that created real opportunity for us in learning, as well as the obvious need. Headsets for everyone. Yes, indeed. Ramping up the use of virtual learning. Desire to skill up to work from home. And that was probably early on in what I'm calling, the fierce urgency of now in that early part of the pandemic, as people had to adjust to working from home. There was a real burning need for us to support people to adapt mindset and skills to working from home. Wellness courses, yes, Alex. I think there was an interesting human capital report at the start of 2010 from Deloitte, which had already indicated that there was a strong interest in well-being and wellness, which has just been amplified by the pandemic. Business continuity, yeah, that was critical and has been critical to shift to online for business continuity and onboarding remotely. That's something which a number of organisations I'm in contact with are still working on getting right. Let's take some of those examples, and I invite you to think about what kind of value that you've created and the way we in L&D typically talk about value. This is a wonderful spectrum which Laura Overton has created. Some of you may be aware of Laura Overton from her time when she founded and led Towards Maturity, which was where she led basically a body of longitudinal benchmarking research over 15 to 16 years around what was happening in learning and what those organisations who created higher value and impact in their what the L&D teams did that created higher value and impact in their organisations, and how they thought and worked differently from those that weren't creating as high an impact in their organisations. And one of the insights she derived over that period of time is there's a difference in the way high impact L&D teams think about, talk about, and demonstrate their value versus those who aren't having quite as much impact. And if you look at this spectrum, on the left-hand side, you're seeing some of the kind of metrics which we typically talk about in L&D around activity, the efficiency of our learning operations, people's engagement with learning, and the usefulness of the learning. So when we talk about things like where we shifted to virtual learning, or we introduced a new evaluation tool, or even we created more self-directed learning, these are about learning activity and learning value. If we think about business value, this is where we start talking about the impact we're having in terms of performance and organisational culture. And we had some people talking about supporting people to work from home, supporting people with well-being, supporting people with onboarding and items that were critical to business continuity. I think the pandemic gave us the opportunity to bring business value into sharper relief and to have clearer conversations across our organisations around business value. So when we think about learning strategy and shaping learning strategies, it's important to start with the idea of business value and understanding a business context and what is important to the performance of our organisation, what shifts in culture or what aspects or dimensions of culture, what type of culture is important for our organisation in our context with our business strategy to perform really well, and then to back off that into, well, what's the value proposition of learning? How can our learning strategy help create value in our business context? So that's the first kind of big idea I want to leave you with. And this is a super useful tool that I encourage you to take a look at using the link that Hope's provided and think about how can I shift my thinking and where am I starting with business value and then thinking about, well, so what does that mean for the value proposition of learning and how learning value supports creating business value. So what we're going to cover, having kind of set that, well, what is the target here? If we're trying to craft a strategy that creates value, how do we think about our value? The three areas we're going to look at is, how do you plan and manage the development of organisational learning strategy? How do you work consciously to design a learning technology ecosystem that delivers value in your organisation? And thinking about running small experiments. And this one is going to be more of a challenging us to think about experiments versus pilots and what's the difference and how might we approach experimentation as we develop our learning strategy to see what's really going to work. So let's move into looking at planning and managing strategy development. Want to do a quick check-in on the state of your learning strategy at the moment. Hope's going to share a poll with us which asks, what condition is your learning strategy in right now? So not where did you start pre-pandemic, but right now, today, what condition is your learning strategy in? Let's take a look at that. And I know you guys can't see this yet, but we've got lots of responses coming in. As you vote, after you've voted, let's have a conversation in the chat about what do you think the critical success factors are to creating a good learning strategy. And the point of this question is, how do you go about creating a good learning strategy? Not what needs to be in the strategy, but in terms of the way you develop and manage the development of your learning strategy, what are the critical success factors to get that process right? So Hope, let's take a look at the poll results. So it looks like people are leaning into this space. We've got 31% saying we're making good progress. 27% it's in place, but it needs an update. 11% have started but stalled, and we'll talk about some of those challenges that might lead us to stall and how we can approach those. And 9% don't have a strategy. So there's a bit of a mix right across the spectrum here. It's a good idea to refresh your strategy annually. It shouldn't need significant changes every year if you've done your work right at setting it up in a way that's more enduring and aligned to business context and business strategy, but a check-in every year is a good idea. So let's have a look at some of those responses around what are the critical success factors. And thank you, there's lots of them, which is fantastic. I'm seeing a bit there about business partnering, understanding the business need, absolutely, and getting leadership buy-in, connecting with learners and understanding business objectives, more about leadership buy-in, understanding skill or knowledge gaps in performance, building it into a learning culture as part of a modern learning system. If that suits your organisation, the idea of learning culture is interesting, and I'm a big advocate of learning culture. It's a long-term game. And you need to express in your learning strategy what your current state is, if you're heading down a path of learning culture and self-directed learning, and what it's going to take to bridge from where you are now to where you want to be. Capturing metrics, yes, so research and evaluation is important. Okay, so I think you guys are on the right track. Creativity, I like that. Yeah, thinking a little outside the box, and the creativity element. We're going to talk about experiments later, which are one way of exploring creatively what's in your strategy, and also stakeholder engagement to sort of get the creative ideas flowing and to shed some of your assumptions which may be blinding you to what's possible. So I'm going to come back to the critical success factors and summarize them. And I think you guys have done a great job nailing quite a lot of them. The hallmarks of a good learning strategy. If you come at it with a human-centered design or user-centered design lens, this is a model taken from user-centered design. In a good strategy, you shouldn't have to sell the strategy. It shouldn't be a whole stack of pushing and trying to market the strategy to get people to buy into it after you've created it. If you're in that place, then I would encourage you to go back and take another look at some of the steps in how you've developed your learning strategy and do a refresh. It should be so desirable because you've done such a great job at understanding how people learn, what they're interested in learning, in their context, that they want to engage with the learning approaches that you're offering through their strategy. It should be viable. There should be a clear value proposition. So there should be a clear linkage or line of sight from your learning strategy to how does it create value in your business for your senior leaders, for your managers, and for your workforce more generally. That should be explicitly stated in your learning strategy. And then finally, it has to be viable. You have to be able to do it within the budget, the resource, the technology that you have, or you need to create the case for change to adjust those. So these are three good criteria I would be using to constantly test. Have we got a good learning strategy? How do you get to a good learning strategy? Here are some of the things you avoid doing. The first thing is not to copy someone else's. Your strategy should be customized for your organization. It shouldn't be a matter of just picking up someone else's and saying, yeah, we'll just tweak this a little bit and roll it out. Apple pie. Sometimes learning strategies are too idealistic. We say, well, we're going to have a learning culture, we're going to do self-directed learning, but they're not clear enough about how you're going to make that possible or what's critical to create that in your context, in your organization. Ivory tower, if your learning and development team, or even in conjunction with your broader HR team, if you're developing your learning strategy in isolation, then you're going to be disconnected from what your organization really needs, and you're going to have a hard time selling it. The blindfolded refers to not doing your research. We have many assumptions in learning and development about what's really happening in our workplace, what our workers really want and need, and what their potential is. We often underestimate the level of willingness and readiness to engage with self-directed learning in particular, and we hold back, or we're a little paternalistic towards our learners rather than focusing on creating the right conditions for them to engage in self-directed learning, as an example. The idea of Lego blocks, of just sort of saying, well, here's 5 elements of a strategy and here's 4 choices, without really stepping back and doing the research. I've seen some of the big consulting firms approach learning strategy in that way, and that's when you get something that looks like it could belong to anyone, a bit of a cookie cutter approach. And also outsourcing. It's fine to get consultants to help you with your learning strategy, but it requires deep thinking in conjunction with your stakeholders. And it's important that you do that thinking yourself to get really embedded in the conversation with your stakeholders and the research. So what are then the critical success factors for how you go about developing your learning strategy to avoid these common pitfalls? Firstly, is starting with that focus on business value. As part of your early thinking and your research, really look hard at your business strategy. Really look hard at what are the major divisions, what's the value chain, who creates value in our organisation, and how do they do it? and understand what your business targets are and what's shifting in your business, what the major bodies of strategic work are that are coming up in the next 12 months to 3 years, because you can anchor what the value proposition is for your learning strategy in that. Stakeholder engagement, you guys were all over that and you picked up on that. Engage early, have a stakeholder engagement plan, engage often, and using human-centered design approaches is a fantastic way to achieve that, particularly with stakeholders we might not normally engage enough with, which is the people at the front line, the workforce that we're trying to support. Do your research, have a research plan, actually create early on, and we're going to talk about stages of strategy development, but create your research plan. Figure out what do we need to know in order to get this strategy right and create value. What do we already know? What data do we have that we can already pull on? Often your engagement surveys or pulse surveys are a good starting point. If you're doing a good job already with evaluation of your existing initiatives, you can go back to that data. But you may need to do some additional research in the shape of surveys or human-centered design interviews. Look also externally. What benchmarking can you do? What case studies might you be able to draw on? I Hope mentioned my own podcast, Learning Uncut, which is really a series of case studies with the people from the organisations that made them happen, which are published once a fortnight. And we've been doing that now for 3 years with my team. So they're a source of case studies, but look at what other organisations that are doing that might be similar that you might be able to adapt. And then finally, of course, really understand your context and lean into your workforce. Not only what are they learning inside of work, but what are they learning outside of work? How are they learning it? What technology are they using for their work? And for their external activities outside of your organisation, and blow away some of those assumptions. You know, the work I did at Qantas was absolutely fascinating. We did a piece of work we called the Learner Intelligence Survey, which we engaged towards maturity to help us with. And we went out and did a whole of workforce survey. We ended up having, I think, around 2,000 responses, and then we looked at different parts of the workforce. The most interesting example was the baggage handlers. These are people who aren't given mobile, they're not supposed to use their mobile phones in the workplace. They're not given data plans. The organisation certainly doesn't pay for mobile phones or for any tech. They're doing physical work, and many of them have low levels of high school education, English as a second language. The assumption was we cannot use technology to support learning and performance for these people. It turned out that 70% of them were using their own mobile phone to access resources to help them do their job. So it just blew away the assumption. So do your research, and in particular research around the reality for your workforce. So let's talk then about a high-level process for creating a great learning strategy. Follow a robust process and think about life cycle. Take your time up front to do your diagnosis well before you start shaping up what should our strategy look like. Be thoughtful about the implementation, and all the way through, be thinking about how we're going to sustain this. How do we set ourselves up for success in sustaining this? So I'm going to walk briefly through these 4 stages. This first one, diagnose, is all about understanding your industry context, your business strategy, and the current state of learning in your organisation, and benchmarking, things like doing a maturity assessment on your learning and development function, in addition to some of that other workforce-centred research I talked about, as well as really understanding your business strategy, speaking directly to some of your business leaders as part of that research as well. Once you've done that, and you can do a SWOT analysis on that, you're then wanting to ask yourself the question, what's the value proposition for learning in your organisation? If you've done your human-centered design work and created personas for your major groups, and you should have at least 3 personas, one for your senior leaders, one for your frontline leaders or managers, and one for your workforce. If you have a really diverse workforce or a lot of different business units, you may want more than 3, but don't get too many or it gets quite confusing. Look for what's common across those different sectors. And then ask yourself the question using something like a value proposition canvas, which you can look up. Strategize. I have a great value proposition canvas. Given what we know about this group, what they're trying to get done in the course of a day, or what their aspirations are longer term for both the impact they're having through their work and their careers, what are the pain points that get in the way of them achieving that? And what might be real wins for them? And how can our learning strategy create value? And actually putting together a clear statement of value, and then thinking about what needs to be in our learning strategy in terms of the approaches to learning that we undertake in our organisation, and how we evaluate and measure that. So at that point, you've got an idea of what your learning strategy needs to look like, what kind of methodologies you're going to use, how you're going to generate self-directed learning, or an environment that is desirable and attractive to your people. You'll have some ideas about what kind of learning technology you might need, and we're going to talk a bit more about your learning tech ecosystem in a moment. But before you go all in and say, this is what we're committing to, it's a great idea to do some testing so that you can try some things out and iterate before you lock into, yes, this is a learning strategy that's going to work. And of course, you want to be looking continuously and evaluating what's happening with our learning strategy. How can we fine tune it? What's working, what's not working? But at this point, before you lock in and take your case for change, for approval, do some testing to figure out what is really going to work. What are your hypotheses, and do they stand up? And we're going to talk about testing towards the end of this session as well. And then finally, have a good governance system in place for making decisions about ongoing focus. What initiatives are you going to work on? Specifically, you've got limited resource, limited capacity. So where are you going to allocate those, and who in the business is going to be helping to make those decisions so that you know you're doing the right things to create business value? You should have some sort of governance board. You might call it, a steering committee. There's different language you might use for it, but decisions about what initiatives you should be working on should not be made just by learning and development. Engage with your business leaders in that, and then have some sort of evaluation framework for your strategy itself. Understand your benefits that you're looking to realize and how you're going to measure those, and share that with your governance group to help monitor and course correct as you go along. So let's look at designing your learning tech ecosystem. And I can see there's a few questions coming in, which Hope is monitoring for us. But in terms of designing your learning tech ecosystem, having looked at what are the critical success factors, when do you start designing your learning tech ecosystem? It's never one of the first places you go. You can certainly be researching how people are using tech, researching during that diagnosis phase, how effective is the tech we're using, where might our gaps be? But before you lock into a learning tech ecosystem, you need to do some real critical thinking. And to do that, you need some sort of philosophy. You need to examine what your beliefs are around learning technology. So if we can have some chat, what are your beliefs or views regarding learning technology? What do you think the role of learning technology is? What's the value of learning technology? How best can we use learning technology? So let's share in the chat some of our beliefs or views regarding the value of learning technology. And I did see a question there about whether the presentation will be sent to attendees or a link provided. I can certainly provide a PDF for it to be available to people. So Leanne, thank you. It needs to be easily accessible. Oh, it needs to be an enabler. Yes, absolutely. I'm going to come back to this point quite heavily around enabling and not driving learning through the tech. Can increase engagement. It's a tool, not the focus. I think we're coming to grips a lot better with the role of learning tech. And I think a lot of these philosophies are really on point. On-demand options, that's increasingly important, right? Particularly now, we're pretty much all working with distributed workforces, even if we've only ever recruited in one geographic location. That's become more important, and accessibility is increasingly important. Don't just use it as a default for everything, and don't get locked into one type of tech all the time, that this is the answer. I think some flexibility in your learning tech ecosystem is important, and we're going to explore why. Adina, hard to separate learning tech from learning content. That's a really interesting question, an interesting frame. I'm just going to make a note of that to talk a little bit more about that relationship between your learning tech and your learning content. I think I've got a useful framework to share with you that will help us to explore that. So engagement, and what I'm seeing here is it needs to be engaging, it needs to be easy to use, it needs to enable but not drive learning, it needs to be integrated with other systems to understand the employee life cycle. So we need to be thinking about it more broadly in terms of where it sits with other technology in the organisation. And I think you guys are on point with this again. So there's a really great piece of research which Red Thread did last year, which was supported by Axonify, the art and science of designing a learning technology ecosystem. Unfortunately, the whole research report is behind a firewall, which is a paid firewall, so you can't get to the whole report, but there's an infographic I'm going to share with you in a moment where you can get to a summary of the key points out of this particular report. And what they did was they went and had a look at the learning technology ecosystem in a whole range of organisations, and they interviewed or talked to the people who'd created the learning tech ecosystems in the L&D teams, in the HR teams, and asked them about how they'd created them. And what they found, they unearthed that those who had intentionally created their, and this is kind of pretty obvious, right, when you think about it, those who had intentionally created their learning tech ecosystem had much higher quality ecosystems in place. They were having more impact with their learning tech ecosystems and getting more value out of them. But that they found there were three key ways of thinking about learning technology, which differentiated those that had well-crafted tech ecosystems from those that didn't. And the first one of those, which you guys have picked up in the chat, is you should think about your learning tech enabling learning, rather than being the savior of learning or the provider of learning. It's also about creating conditions to encourage people to learn and develop. And that's not always about pushing out content or making content accessible. We're going to look at different ways of enabling people to learn and develop and creating those conditions where they can learn and develop, often without L&D having to be there to guide them more towards that learning culture and self-directed learning. The second aspect was this idea that we're designing instead of just assembling over time bits and pieces, that we're stepping back and taking a holistic look at what do we need in our learning technology ecosystem. And it's a thoughtful extension of our employee learning experience and indeed our end-to-end employee life cycle and how we support our people through that life cycle and gain insight to that life cycle. Two key factors they found. One is it should be as simple as possible. And again, you guys have talked about easy to access. That's part of the simplicity. Easy to administer, of course, as well as important, so it doesn't become inefficient, cumbersome for us. The second factor is that it should cover all employees. We're working with increasingly diverse workforces, not just in terms of things like cultural diversity or educational diversity, but in terms of the way organisations engage talent. So if your learning tech ecosystem isn't accessible to contractors and you have a large contractor workforce, or to casuals, as an example, then you've got gaps in terms of it being available to all, because our workforces are increasingly hybrid. And thirdly, the idea that we should be thinking about all technology, not just technology that we've specifically purchased for learning. We should also be thinking about adopting technologies that people are already using for working. And Microsoft Teams is a great example of that, right? That we've really scaled into over the past year. Microsoft, of course, is investing more heavily in the functionality needed to use Teams for learning as well as working. But what about thinking about systems such as obviously your messaging systems, your enterprise social network, or even the systems that your people are working in day to day, maybe customer relationship management system or your SAP systems in your manufacturing environment. How could they be used to support learning? So your learning tech philosophy, your learning tech ecosystem should encompass those as well. And then finally, as part of that, enabling technologies that people are already using anyway. So you might discover through your research that you've got a whole stack of people or a particular segment of the workforce that are using WhatsApp a lot for personal purposes. How might you lean into that if that's the tech they're familiar with and that's the space that they're in? Is that potentially part of your learning tech ecosystem? So really thinking thoughtfully about how you pull all those elements together. And of course, we're well beyond the idea of tech as a silver bullet, either generally or any specific tech. Technology is critical to get right and to intentionally design to enable your learning strategy. But the research from Towards Maturity certainly found that there is no one specific technology that those L&D teams that are having high impact use versus those who don't. And in fact, often it's those who are using less technology. And as our learning development functions mature, we tend to do a lot of experimenting early and then figure out what really works for us, and have a smaller learning tech suite, if you like. But that will dramatically accelerate learning transformation, getting that right. So we talked about this idea of enabling, and some of you talked about our learning techniques to enable learning. The idea of content was also mentioned. I want you to do some reflection as we just look at what sort of activities do we want to enable for our people to be able to learn and perform. And consuming content is one of those activities. If we're moving towards self-directed learning culture, we need to ask that question around planning. How does our learning tech help our employees to discover their career options and to identify what's needed for their development so they can take control of their own development and self-manage their own development? In terms of discovery, how does our learning tech, which again includes our workplace tech, how does that enable employees to find the right type of opportunities and content that will take them where they want to go? How does it help them to connect with other people who are relevant to where they want to go, either to solve immediate performance needs or to develop for a future career pathway? Consumption, we've talked about. Experiment, how does it enable employees to practice new knowledge and skills? It's one thing to consume content and acquire new knowledge and skills, but how do we give people the opportunity and support them to practice new knowledge and skills and get feedback? Connection, we've talked about briefly, and performing. How does our learning tech enable our employees to perform better on the job and to learn while doing it? So hopefully you've been reflecting. I'll just give you a moment. We'll share on this in a moment. That what's your most important gap right now? Where is the opportunity to strengthen quite consciously by enabling your people to do some of these things to strengthen your learning tech ecosystem? Perhaps you've gone all out on consumption and you've got a great learning content library that allows people to access anytime. But maybe it doesn't allow them an opportunity to experiment, to practice. Maybe your performance support is not where it needs to be, and that would really help people to solve questions, to troubleshoot, to figure out process. This is a great place to think about how could you use things like your customer relationship management system or your manufacturing and operating systems. The research by Red Thread took this one step further and said, well, what are the kinds of learning, what are the kinds of technology functions that would be really helpful or are most aligned to these activities? And they've added admin, of course, on the back end. So if we look at what might be missing in your learning tech ecosystem, based on what you've just reflected on as the area to most lean into. So for Timothy, you've mentioned experiment. Andy, you've also mentioned experiment. There's a few options that they've identified in this research around video practice and the opportunity to get feedback using videos, augmented reality and virtual reality as practice spaces, project marketplaces where people can see what's available in terms of project opportunities across the organisation, so they can potentially volunteer for projects or see where they might be able to practice their skills. What other opportunities might there be available to enable experimentation through learning tech? So share with me which of these areas you think would be most valuable, knowing that your strategy, if you designed it consciously, you may not need to cover each of these functions to the same extent. And there's no one saying that you need every single one of these types of tech in your learning tech suite. It's around being really conscious about it. We're going to move into the idea of experiments in a moment as well, and conducting experiments for L&D to conduct experiments as opposed to supporting your people to conduct experiments. Simulations are another great idea, another great piece of functionality that we can enable with learning tech to help people to practice and experiment. So where is the functionality that you most need to build into your learning tech ecosystem, coming at it from kind of a well-considered place? The infographic, which Hope shared the link to earlier, that Axonify published out of this research, really helps. It lays out these functionalities so you can go back and use that in a more considered way. This is an awesome framework to be thinking about your learning tech roadmap, and crafting a learning tech roadmap very consciously. And I think your plan is your biggest gap, and you're using experiments only for a small cohort of staff. So that plan piece is really critical. It's not enough to just create an environment where resources are available to people. It's a bit like, they can channel surf, but if they're thinking more consciously about what they need to access, who they need to access, because they've planned what kind of activities they need for developing themselves, that closes the loop and makes what we've made available in terms of content and connection to others so much more valuable. So let's talk about experiments next, and the idea of running small experiments to test what might work. And in this context, we're talking about the digital component of your learning strategy. So how do we test what's going to be effective in our organisation and our context? Let's lean into that. So let's have some chat here. How do you currently experiment with ideas about what might work for learning in your organisation? What do you do at the moment to run experiments and test ideas and approaches out? Beta test with a small group. Pilot, yes, that's pretty common to pilot something with a small group. Susan's cottoned onto pilots as well. Use your A-type people. Who are you, what do you mean by A-type people, Gigi? Maybe if you can get a little bit more. It's not a term I've heard used before. Use different technologies and ask for feedback. Test different things out. Yep. Pilot with colleagues before launching to customers. An agile approach, Seema, yes, an agile approach does allow you to build minimum viable product, to put something out, to test it quickly. A/B testing with evaluation. So there's a number of things you're currently doing to experiment. I want to go back and do some thinking about experiments with you, and what experiments really are and how we structure them. And this is the good old scientific method, right? Which is the basis of experiments. Firstly, there's the explore. And in the explore, we're exploring a challenge or a need for some sort of solution. We're understanding what it looks like at the moment, what the business need is, what actions people might need to take, if any, if indeed there is actually a learning problem underlying the request for your support. And we're developing some ideas about what might work. We're moving into that theorise phase in order to address this particular business challenge. And we're going to work through an example in a moment. What are our ideas about what might work and what we could do to help address that business challenge? And if we do some of these things, what do we expect the outcome might be? I heard a great quote. Some of you may know Trish Uhl, who runs an organisation called Owl's Ledge, and she works a lot with data analytics and learning engineering. And I interviewed Trish about a project from Mars last year, and she said something that I just thought was so profound. She said, what if you approached everything you do in learning as a hypothesis? Because you never know if something's going to work out or not. How might you approach testing, experimenting, and evaluating differently? Gigi's asked the question around A/B testing. A/B testing is where you have a control group, or you can test two different approaches in parallel at the same time with two different groups and see which one works. So you're kind of almost running a competition between two different approaches and testing to see which one works. It's picked up from marketing, the idea. Often on social media marketing, people will put out campaigns or ads with different headlines or different calls to action at the same time and just see what happens with them. Okay, so if we work through this, then we've got an idea about what might work, and we need to run some sort of test. Now, the way we often run our experiments, and thank you, Hope, for that message, the way we often run our experiments is we get to a stage where we run a pilot. We've got an idea, we've shaped up a solution, when we test the solution before we roll it out more broadly. The challenge with our pilots is sometimes we've invested so much in them and they're so big already that we've invested in a single big idea. Maybe our big idea is that, e-learning is the answer for this particular issue or challenge. Or our big idea might be that a community of practice is the answer. And we've built something, we've invested a lot of time, it becomes too big almost to fail and step away from. An alternate idea is this idea of Trojan mice, which are a lot more nimble than what we sometimes call Trojan horses. And there's a great blog post that explains this concept of Trojan mice versus Trojan horses, which Hope shared the link to earlier. The idea of Trojan mice is that you get in early and test lots of small ideas in order to gather data about what happens. And they're safe to fail. You haven't overinvested, and what you're doing is you're running these experiments to test a solution. So let's look at an example. In this example, we have a situation where your business context is you're in an environment where product innovation has sped up. More rapid product innovation has been adopted as part of the business strategy, and speed to market is really critical. So you're getting reduced lead times from the time somebody says we're going to market with product XYZ or service XYZ or a change to our service to when it's actually launched. What typical solutions might learning and development deploy to address that? Where might you go with addressing that need? And I know you don't have a lot of context there, but how might L&D typically respond to this particular business need? We can share in the chat typical responses that come to mind. Webinars, possibly, yep. Maybe some micro learning, something small, something agile, with a lowercase a, not a capital A. Live session with SME recorded. So these are small, speedy things that could be done. Now, the question around the idea of Trojan horses or pilots versus experiments, and what I really like about this is you guys have identified some things that you could readily test. You're not having to overcommit. Focus groups would be good as part of your research. So when we think about this, there'd be a number of experiments that we could run with this particular scenario that could help our people to connect with each other around the product innovation, to access information in the moment of need with products that are going to market quickly, to perhaps practice, to practice how they're responding to customer queries, to practice how they're talking to customers about product innovation if the target audience is your front line. And there's a whole stack of little things you might try. So the idea of experiments is to test some of these things and to figure out what you could test on a low scale without over-investing in the technology in particular, or over-investing in your solution design, and have a good plan for gathering data to see what is working, what's not working, and then lean into the space with some of it rather than locking onto one thing, and doing that quite purposefully. So I think this particular scenario, because it's saying, we've looked at a scenario around having to do things quickly, I think that opens us up to more experimentation. But have a think about how could you do these kind of experiments, perhaps for things like leadership development, where there's often not quite as much urgency around getting new skills, new knowledge out to people. And identify lots of these little experiments and tests. And with your learning strategy, if we can bring that back to the context of a bigger piece on your learning strategy, as you shape your learning strategy, before you lock into tech, test some of your ideas out, thinking about what are we trying to enable our people to do and what tech might help as part of the solution to enable them to do that, and test lots of things early in that implementation stage before you lock into anything and lock into your investment in learning tech. So we've reached the end of kind of the presentation and interaction around planning and managing strategy development, designing your tech ecosystem, and running small experiments to test what might work. There's a couple of additional resources available from Go1 who've generously sponsored this webinar, which Hope will pop in the chat there. One is an infographic, which I've created in conjunction with Laura Overton and Shannon Tipton from Learning Rebels in the US, who some of you may know, around questions to build your L&D strategy on strong digital foundations, as well as an article that Go1 have published that I guest authored for them around crafting a digital learning strategy that creates value. So you can dig into some of these ideas a little deeper with those resources. So thank you to Go1 for their sponsorship today. And we've got about 10 minutes left for Q&A. So how are we going with the questions, Hope?
Absolutely, yeah, we do have a couple that have come into the Q&A panel. Thank you, Michelle, for taking the time to share all these awesome insights with us today. Our first question here is from Ralston, who asks, do you have a universal framework for creating a learning strategy? Would be great to explore.
Yeah, I have a whole stack of templates and tools that I use. And I've got sort of a process I call my strategy builder process that I use with organizations. So I think your question's around what would you expect to see in a learning strategy? And if I can just maybe walk through that to give you some idea. Your learning strategy, in terms of how you present it, you need to be able to get it to one page, the key elements to one page. I would always go for a PowerPoint format for presenting and talking to different stakeholders about the learning strategy, and you can test your learning strategy out by starting to shape that as you pull your thinking together towards the end of the diagnose phase to run your consultations and get feedback about where you're heading with your strategy. And then in many organizations, some sort of longer form Word document might be necessary or appropriate. But I would always start with what's our context? What are the key challenges that we need to address with our and business challenges, not learning challenges? Start with the business. Always anchor in the business and the context your business is going through. So what are the business challenges we need to address? Go through your value proposition. What's the value proposition for our different stakeholders? And often there's also the question of the value proposition for your customers, be they, in the case of a government organisation, your citizens, and the government that you're serving as well, or your consumers. Maybe you've got partners, distribution channels, so there's a value proposition for them. So what's your value proposition? And then you work through, in order to achieve this value proposition, what are our principles about how we're going to learn in our organisation? Maybe one of our principles is, everyone is learning continuously. People can access learning from anywhere at any time. Our learning is strongly aligned to business value and business strategy. So these are things that can help guide decision making on an ongoing basis in learning. So you've started with what's the context, you've gone through to what's the value proposition, how do we make decisions, and then you go into what are the key action areas. And your key action areas, I often call them pillars. These are the critical things you need to get right based on where you are now to deliver your learning strategy. So they might be areas like governance. Maybe we need to really strengthen our governance to get business alignment right. Maybe community is really important. Maybe you're in an organisation where your L&D teams are really decentralised and you're not going to restructure, but building community and connection and collaboration across them is critical to get right to deliver your learning strategy and realise your vision. Technology is often an element that needs some attention, but it's normally 3 or 4 critical things that you've got to nail, and then you've got an action plan against them. For how you're going to realise that vision, and some sort of statement around benefits realisation. How will we know if we're on track? And I would normally lay out a learning strategy over 3 horizons. Here's the first year and the foundations we're going to lay, and you'd have more detail around what we're going to do. Then here's sort of the middle chunk of time, maybe I don't know, 12 to 8, 12 to to 24 months, and then there's another horizon. And what do we expect to see in terms of business value, in terms of how our people experience learning at each of these horizons, and in terms of potentially what's happening with our learning and development activities and how we work in learning and development. So kind of in a nutshell, you should be able to get all of that on one page. I've got a template for how to get that all on one page, but with a lot more thinking. And then you've got your research behind it, but that's kind of just supporting. That's kind of in your appendix or your annex, your research that supports your thinking. So there you go. A quick walkthrough of what I would expect to see in a good learning strategy. What you don't have is, here's what our training needs analysis says about the 5 skills that we need this year, because you want your learning strategy to be enduring. So if the skills that your organisation needs shift, you shouldn't need to go back and update your learning strategy. It's only when your business context changes or your level of maturity improves to the point where you're ready to create even more value in different ways.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you so much for that thoughtful answer. Let's see, we have a couple questions from Gigi here. They ask, what if the learning strategy has been reviewed and approved by your manager and upper management, but not the line managers who will actually be using it? What do we do in that scenario? And then what if the line managers are resistant to change?
Yeah, then I would pick that learning strategy up and put it on a shelf. And I would go out and spend time talking to the line managers, because they don't need to approve it, but they need to find it desirable. It needs to really speak to their needs. So I would go back and do some human-centered design work and look at, what are the challenges they face? What are they trying to get done with their team, with their day-to-day work? What are the pain points that get in the way? And I wouldn't approach it from the perspective of, what do your people need to learn and how do you want them to learn? I'd approach from the perspective of, how does your team add value in this organisation? How does your team get results? What do they need to do to perform well? And then you back into it from there. What gets in the way of that? And how can learning help to address those pain points or help you to realise your goals and aspirations? Develop personas and work through that idea of value proposition and talk to them. If we were to approach performance support in this way, or if we were able to make it possible for your people to learn in this way, or if we were to equip you with resources and tools and support in this way, would that be of value to you? And then go back and have a look at how might you need to reshape your learning strategy, and then go and seek approval from your more senior leaders. That's how I would approach it anyway. But you want them to want to engage. You don't want to have to be pushing or dragging them to it. You've got something wrong in terms of those pitfalls if you're not at that point.
Absolutely, ensuring that the solutions we're providing are serving the people that they're meant to.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much. We have time for one more question here, I believe. We have one from Elizabeth, who has a question about building those learner personas. Do you have a template for building learner personas, or rather, what are maybe some of the questions we should be asking when we're setting out to get to know our audience?
Sure. There's some great tools for personas available online. We've really picked up personas from human-centered design. So there's lots of templates for personas. I find, in terms of a really valuable tool that a lot of people maybe don't know about or don't use, there's a company called Strategizer who have something called, I'm just typing this in, a value proposition canvas. Which picks up, it summarizes the persona in terms of what are the jobs your people are trying to get done. And that's not just what are their physical jobs, but emotionally what's important to them. And the pain points and the gains. But you back into that through a persona template, and there are lots of good ones available. Just go out and have a look at some of those and play with those, is what I would suggest to figure out what works for you, and take a look at that value proposition canvas. I've customized that quite heavily for the work I do. In learning and development strategy, and it's part of my strategy builder toolkit that I use.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much again, Michelle, for taking the time today to share all these awesome insights and strategies with the audience. We appreciate it so much. Thank you.
My pleasure. And someone's mentioned there, Vivian's mentioned that ATD has a learning persona template. There are a number that are around specifically for learning personas. I'll just pop, there's a guy named Aaron Pradhan in Australia who has one that's publicly available on his website. So if you look up Aaron Pradhan, you'll be able to find that.
Wonderful. Awesome. Yeah, well, we have plenty of all those resources in the chat for you all. Make sure to save that so that you can look at those resources later. But yes, again, thank you, Michelle. And in closing, I'd just like to take a quick moment to invite all of you to join us for some upcoming training industry webinars. You can find out what's next, register for an event, or watch past webinars now at www.trainingindustry.com. And as a reminder, all of our webinars are pre-qualified for 1 credit hour by SHRM, HRCI, ISPI, and CPTM. What is CPTM, you ask? It is the Certified Professional and Training Management Program that assists you in developing the core competencies to empower you to manage the future training needs of your organization. You can participate in a virtual practicum from anywhere in the world today. You can find more information at trainingindustry.com/CPTM. And I hope you'll consider joining us next week for our next installment of our L&D Insider Series on blended learning technologies on May 27th. During this Insider Series, thought leaders from industry innovators will explore the varying use cases for blended learning and demonstrate how learning leaders can leverage those solutions to provide impactful learning strategies that result in learning transfer on the job. You can register now for free at trainingindustry.com/webinar. And just one last reminder, that an evaluation survey should have popped open in another tab in your browser, and we greatly welcome your feedback around anything regarding today's presentation. Once again, thank you to our presenter, Michelle Ockers, and of course to our sponsor, GoOne, and to all of you for your time and attention today. With Training Industry, I'm Hope Williams, signing off. Have a great day, everybody.